I kept my hands folded in my lap and didn't say a word. My name is Lee Calloway. I'm 31 years old. I run a small residential cleaning company out of Barrie, Ontario. 14 staff, 3 vans, and more 5-star Google reviews than most restaurants in the area. I own a condo 2 blocks from Kempenfelt Bay. I meal prep on Sundays, and I pay my taxes on time. And I call my grandmother every Thursday evening without fail. None of that mattered at my brother's wedding. None of that has ever mattered to my family. Let me back up. I grew up the middle child in a household where being the middle child was somehow both invisible and blamed for everything. My older brother, I'll just call him my brother throughout this because honestly, his name isn't the point, was the golden one from the start. Smart, charming, the kind of kid teachers remembered 5 years after he left their class. My younger sister was the baby, and in my family, the baby was sacred. That left me in a strange pocket of nothing. Not the first, not the last. Just there. My parents ran a hardware store in Innisfil for most of my childhood. My father worked the floor and my mother did the books, and between the two of them, they built something modest and reliable. I respected that. I genuinely did. But what I couldn't reconcile, what took me years and a lot of quiet drives along the 400 to finally accept, was how differently the three of us were treated under the same roof. My brother got a car for his 18th birthday, a used Civic, sure, but a car. A real one with a bow on it in the driveway. My sister got a trip to Montreal with my mother for hers. 4 days, spa day, shopping on St. Catherine Street, the full thing. I got a card with a $50 bill inside and a dinner at Montana's where my father spent most of the meal talking about my brother's acceptance into the University of Guelph. I didn't make a scene. I ate my riblets and said thank you. That was the year I started learning that in my family, keeping quiet was the price of keeping the peace. I got very good at it. Too good, probably. After high school, I took a business administration certificate at Georgian College. Not a degree, a 2-year certificate. My father made a joke at Christmas dinner that year. One of those jokes that's not really a joke, that I was taking the practical route. He said it with a small smile, the kind that's supposed to signal affection but land somewhere closer to pity. My mother laughed. My brother, home from Guelph with a girlfriend and a new haircut, didn't say anything. My sister, who was 16 and already obsessed with becoming a pharmacist, stared at her mashed potatoes. I stared at mine too. I graduated, got a job with a property management company doing tenant coordination, and spent 3 years learning every corner of how a building runs. That's actually where the idea started. I kept watching the cleaning contracts come and go, companies that were inconsistent, that didn't show up, that sent different people every time, so tenants never knew who was coming into their building. I thought, I can do this better. I started reading everything I could, took an online small business course to the Business Development Bank, saved $11,000 over 18 months, registered Callaway Clean in the fall of 2018 with 1 client, 1 part-time employee, and a second-hand minivan I bought from a retired teacher in Oral Medonti. I told my parents when it was already running, not as a request for permission. I was 25, I didn't need it, but because I thought they'd be happy for me. My mother's first question was whether I had a backup plan. My father asked if cleaning houses was really what I wanted to do with my education. I drove home alone that night and sat in my parking lot for 20 minutes before going inside. The business grew anyway, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily and on purpose. I hired carefully. I paid people fairly. Above minimum wage, mileage covered, no surprise schedule changes without compensation. We got contracts with 2 condo buildings in Barrie and 1 medical clinic in Collingwood. By 2022, I was pulling in just over $400,000 annually in revenue and clearing a healthy margin. I wasn't rich, but I was genuinely, solidly fine. My family didn't know any of this. Not the real numbers, not the details. When they asked how work was going, I said, good. When my father asked if I was still doing the cleaning thing, I said yes. When my mother mentioned that my sister had just been promoted to pharmacy manager at 26, and wasn't that remarkable, I said that it was, because it was. My sister worked hard. I didn't resent her. I just grew tired of being the reference point for what not to become. My brother got engaged in 2023 to a woman I'll call his fiancée. She's kind. Genuinely, she was always warm to me when we crossed paths at family dinners, and I want to be clear that what happened at the wedding wasn't her fault. She'd been with my brother for 4 years. The engagement party was at my parents' house in Innisfil, backyard. Catered. About 40 people. I brought a bottle of Toss Riesling and a card with a check for $300 inside. At the party, my uncle, my father's older brother, retired, lives out in Kelowna now, came up to me and said, "Lee, so what are you doing with yourself these days?" He's a nice enough man. I don't think he meant it as a slight, but there's a tone that people in my family use when they ask me that question. A tone that is distinct from the tone they use when they ask my brother or my sister, and I have had enough years of practice to hear it immediately. I told him I ran a cleaning company. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're deciding what to say next. My father appeared beside us at that exact moment, the way he does, and said, "She keeps busy." That was it. That was the whole endorsement. She keeps busy. I excused myself to get more wine. The wedding was set for late June. My brother asked me to be in the wedding party, which I was. I want to acknowledge that because it matters. He did include me. But inclusion in my family has always had a particular texture to it, where you're present but not quite seen, invited but not quite celebrated, there but not quite counted. In the months leading up to the wedding, the planning was all-consuming for my mother. She is the kind of woman who is energized by occasion, and a wedding gave her more material than she'd had in years. She was involved in everything: the venue, the florals, the seating chart, the welcome speech she was writing for the rehearsal dinner. She called me twice about bridesmaid dresses. Both times the conversation ended with her mentioning my sister's schedule and how careful we all had to be around it, because pharmacy doesn't stop for weddings. I bought the dress she picked. I showed up to the 2 fittings. I smiled in all the photos. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant in Barrie. Private room, long table, about 25 family members and close friends. My mother had written a speech. She stood up near the end of dinner with a glass of Ontario Pinot Gris, and she talked about my brother, his kindness, his work ethic, his new job as a project manager with a construction firm in Vaughan. She talked about his fiancé's family, welcoming them warmly. She talked about how proud she was. Then she said something I have thought about every day since. She was wrapping up the speech, and she turned to the table and said, and I remember it exactly, "We're so proud of both our kids. Ethan is building something real, and little Mara is going to be the best pharmacist this province has seen." She looked at my sister when she said it, and my sister beamed, and everyone laughed and clapped. She didn't look at me. She didn't say my name. 25 people in the room. My brother's in-laws, his friends from university, people who had known our family for years. Not one mention. Not a clause, not a phrase, not a glance. I sat at that table and I kept my expression completely neutral, and I thought about the drive home and what I would listen to on the 400, and whether I had enough coffee pots for the morning. My father leaned over after she sat down and said quietly, "You look great tonight, kiddo." I said thank you. That was it. The wedding itself was the following afternoon at a heritage property outside Barrie. Stone barn venue, ceremony in the gardens, reception inside with Edison lights and linen tablecloths, and a late-night poutine bar, which I have to say was genuinely inspired. I was happy for my brother. Standing at the front, watching him see his bride come down the aisle, I felt something real. Pride, warmth, the particular sweetness of watching someone you grew up with step into the best version of their life. And then the reception started, and I remembered where I was. The seating arrangement placed me at a table with 2 of my brother's university friends, their partners, and my cousin from my mother's side who I barely know. Fine. I could work with that. What I hadn't anticipated was my mother's approach to the open mic portion of the evening, after dinner, when guests were invited to share a memory or a wish for the couple. My aunt, my mother's sister who lives in Hamilton, went up first. Then 2 of my brother's friends. Then my mother went up again, which I hadn't expected, and she spoke for 7 minutes, I clocked it, about my brother's journey from a little boy building things in the backyard to a man building a life with the woman he loved. She mentioned my sister 3 times. Once as our beautiful Mara who drove up from Mississauga, once as Ethan's biggest supporter growing up, and once as the pharmacist of the family. Which means we always have someone to call about our prescriptions. Which got a big laugh. She made eye contact with me once during those 7 minutes. Once. I smiled. She looked away. At some point in the evening, I was standing near the bar. a glass of Niagara Peninsula Cabernet Franc, which I picked specifically because I knew the vineyard and wanted something that felt like a small act of care for myself. And one of my brother's friends came up beside me. We've been introduced earlier. He worked in commercial real estate in Toronto. We'd had a pleasant 5-minute conversation during cocktail hour about the housing market and whether Barrie was going to keep growing the way it had been. He asked what I did. I told him I ran a residential cleaning company in Barrie. He said, genuinely curious, how large an operation? I said 14 staff, 3 service vehicles, contracts with several residential and commercial properties. He said, so you're essentially running a service business at scale. What's your annual revenue like, roughly? I told him. His eyebrows went up slightly. Not dramatically, he was too professionally composed for that, but I noticed. He said, that's solid. Do you have ambitions to expand, or are you happy with where it is? We talked for 12 minutes. It was the most professionally substantive conversation I had that entire weekend. And then my mother appeared. She came to refill her wine, and she saw me talking with this man, and she inserted herself the way she does, warmly, confidently, the way someone does when they have always believed that their presence improves a room. She put her hand on my arm and said to him, "Oh, you've met Lee. She's Ethan's sister." He said yes. They'd been talking about her company. My mother laughed, a small, slightly confused laugh, and said, "Oh, Lee does cleaning." She said it the way you'd say Lee collects bottle caps. Benign, faintly baffling. We keep telling her she could do something with that business brain of hers, but for now she keeps things tidy. She squeezed my arm and moved on. The man looked at me. I looked at him. He said quietly, "Did she just?" I said, "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I'm sorry." I said it was fine. It wasn't fine. But I had a glass of excellent Cab Franc and a condo in Barrie and 14 people whose livelihoods I was responsible for. And I wasn't going to make a scene at my brother's wedding. I wasn't going to be that. I have too much self-respect to perform my pain for an audience. I drove home that night on the 400 and I listened to nothing, just the road. What happened next didn't happen at the wedding. It happened 6 weeks later, at a Sunday family dinner in Innisfil, the kind my parents still host through the summer. On the back deck, burgers on the gas grill, my mother's potato salad that everyone asks for the recipe for, and she never gives. My brother and his wife were there, newly back from their honeymoon in Portugal. My sister was there. I was there. My father was in a good mood, the kind of mood where he talks more than usual, where the old hockey stories come out and he gestures with his beer. At some point, the conversation turned to money, specifically to whether Barrie real estate was a good buy right now, or whether everything had gotten too inflated. My brother mentioned he and his wife were thinking about a house in Vaughan or maybe further north if prices kept shifting. My father said the best time to buy was always yesterday, classic dad wisdom. My sister mentioned that she'd been putting money into her TFSA and her work pension and felt pretty set. My mother said to me, offhandedly, the way she says things when she thinks they're just conversation, "I suppose your clients at least keep you steady. That's something." And I thought about the rehearsal dinner. I thought about she keeps things tidy. I thought about 18 months of save money and a BDC course and a retired teacher's minivan and every decision I had made quietly, without announcement, without applause, without a single moment of being told I was building something real. I put my fork down. I said calmly, "I want to tell you something about my business, since we're talking about finances." My mother looked at me with polite, faintly surprised attention. I said, "Last year, Callaway Clean generated $420,000 in revenue. After operating costs and payroll, my personal income was just over $110,000. I have no business debt. I have a max TFSA and a healthy RRSP. I own my condo outright. I paid it off in March." I paused. "I have 14 employees. I provide benefits. When one of my staff had a family emergency in February and needed 3 weeks off, I paid her in full and held her position. That is what my cleaning company looks like." The deck was quiet. My brother was looking at the table. His wife was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between respect and discomfort. My sister had stopped with her fork halfway to her mouth. My father had set his beer down. My mother said after a moment, "Well, Lee, I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." I didn't say it with anger. I said it with the same calm I use when I'm going over quarterly numbers with my bookkeeper. Even. Factual. Present. My father said, "You paid off the condo?" I said yes. He said, "At 31?" I said yes. There was another silence, the kind that has texture to it. My brother cleared his throat. My sister took a sip of water. Somewhere in the neighborhood, a lawnmower started. My mother said, "I just worry. Cleaning is physical work, and as you get older." I said, "I don't clean houses. I run a company that cleans houses. There's a difference." She was quiet. I picked my fork back up. I finished my potato salad. I made eye contact with my brother's wife at one point, and she gave me the smallest nod, the kind that means, "I see you." I drove home alone like always. Here's what I want to say about what happened after, because I've thought about how to say this for a long time and I want to get it right. My father called me the following Tuesday evening. Not a long call, maybe 15 minutes. He said he'd been thinking about what I'd said at dinner. He said he hadn't realized how far I'd taken things, and that he was, used the word impressed, which from my father is not a small word. He asked about the employees, about the contracts, about whether I'd ever thought about franchising. We talked about business for the first time, just the two of us, in a way we never had before. At the end of the call, he said, "I'm proud of you, Lee." I sat with that for a few seconds. I said, "Thank you, Dad." I didn't say what I was thinking, which was, I've been doing this for 6 years. But I also didn't need to say it. He knew. I could hear it in the pause before he said goodnight. My mother sent me a text 2 days later. It said, "I realize I haven't asked enough about your work. Can we have lunch?" I said yes. We went to a place on the waterfront in Barrie, and she asked real questions for the first time. Not polite interest. Not the kind of nodding that means you're already thinking about something else, but genuine curiosity. She asked about the employees. She asked how I handled difficult clients. She asked, at one point, whether I'd ever been scared. I said yes, often, especially in the beginning. She said, "I didn't know you had that in you." I didn't know how to feel about that sentence. I still don't, completely. There's something both heartbreaking and hopeful about a parent discovering their child at 31. It means you lost all the years before. But it also means you haven't lost all the years ahead. I don't think my family will ever fully understand what it cost me to build something quietly in the absence of encouragement while watching my achievements get treated like hobbies. That kind of thing leaves a mark. I've sat with a therapist in Barrie every other Thursday for 2 years, and we're still working through what it means to be the child who got left out of the narrative. The work isn't done. But I also don't need them to understand the cost. I just needed them, finally, to see the outcome. I still call my grandmother every Thursday. She's always asked about the company. Always, from the very first contract. She keeps a little notebook where she writes down things I tell her. The new hires, the contracts, the small victories. She's never once said, "I didn't know you had it in you." She said, the very first time I told her I was starting the company, "Well, of course you are." That's what I think about when things get hard. Not the dinners where I wasn't mentioned. Not the wedding speeches that skipped my name. Not the years of, "she keeps busy" and "she keeps things tidy," and the gentle, ongoing implication that I was the one who hadn't quite figured it out yet. I think about my grandmother's little notebook, and the 14 people who show up to work every morning because I built something worth showing up for. That's enough. It has always been more than enough. I keep coming back to one small image, my grandmother's notebook. Not the wedding. Not the deck in Innisfil. Not the moment my father set his beer down and looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. The notebook, a small spiral-bound thing she keeps on her kitchen table, where she writes down the things I tell her about my company. New hires, new contracts, the time we landed the medical clinic account and I called her before I told anyone else. She has been keeping that record since the very beginning, since before I had anything worth recording, because she decided early on that what I was building mattered. I think about what it means that one person's quiet attention held me together through years of being overlooked by everyone else in the same family. There's a version of my story that ends bitterly. I know that version. I could have become someone who carries the weight of those missed birthdays and skipped speeches and "she keeps things tidy" comments like a permanent grievance, someone who needs constant acknowledgement to feel real. That path was available to me. I could see it clearly, especially in the first few years of running the business alone, when the work was hard and no one at home even asked how it was going. What stopped me wasn't stubbornness exactly. It was something closer to a quiet decision I made, somewhere along the 400 on one of those drives home, that I was going to build something honest, something I could stand behind, and I was going to do it whether or not anyone in that house ever understood what I was doing. That's not bravery. That's just the decision to keep going when the people who were supposed to believe in you first didn't show up. And here's what I've learned about that kind of quiet persistence: it compounds. Not because the universe rewards virtue on a schedule, but because the daily choices to act with integrity, to pay your staff fairly, to hold someone's job when they need 3 weeks with their family, to build something real instead of something that just looks real. Those choices shape who you become. By the time my mother said she keeps things tidy at that wedding bar, I had years of evidence that she was wrong. I didn't need to perform my anger. I didn't need to make a speech. I had already built the answer. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. The dinner on the deck was the first time I used my words, and I want to be clear that it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like correction, like setting a record straight, not for drama, but because the people around that table had been operating on incomplete information for 31 years, and I was finally tired of protecting them from the full picture. What my father said at the end of that phone call on Tuesday: "I'm proud of you, Lee. I won't pretend that didn't matter. It mattered enormously. But it didn't change the foundation. The foundation was already there. I had laid it myself, piece by piece, in the absence of that exact sentence." That's the thing nobody tells you about growing up in the gap between what your family sees and who you actually are. You either collapse into that gap or you use it. You use the silence to figure out very precisely what you actually believe and what you're actually capable of. I used it. My grandmother always knew I would. She just kept the notebook ready.